The hand moved first, pale green fingers twitching against the weight of bodies piled above, and Zachary Sullivan nearly dropped his water bucket when he saw it happen in the late afternoon sun. He had been crossing the edge of Marrow Field on his way back from checking the northern fence line, when movement caught his eye near the burial pit, that cursed place where the soldiers had dumped the orc dead after the border skirmish 3 days past. The hand clawed upward through the mass of limbs and torsos, desperate and weak, and without thinking Zachary dropped his bucket and ran toward the grave, his boots slipping on blood-soaked earth. The smell hit him before he reached the edge, that sickly sweet rot mixed with iron that made his stomach turn, but he pushed through it and grabbed hold of that green hand, feeling warm skin beneath his callous palm. She was alive, whoever she was, buried under dozens of her own kind, and he pulled with everything he had, bracing his boots against the soft ground. The bodies shifted as he dragged her free, and when her head emerged into the light he saw her face, young and female with small tusks jutting from her lower jaw, her black hair matted with dried blood and dirt. She gasped when the air hit her lungs fully, a ragged sound that spoke of pain beyond measure, and her amber eyes rolled back briefly before focusing on him. Terror flashed across her features, raw and animal, and she tried to pull away, but her body would not cooperate. Zachary kept his grip gentle but firm, pulling her clear of the pile until she lay on the grass beside the pit, her body revealed in full. She wore the remnants of leather armor, torn and useless now, and her left side was a mess of dried blood from a wound that should have killed her. "Easy now," he said, keeping his voice low and steady like he did with spooked horses. "You're safe. I've got you." She did not understand his words, or perhaps did not trust them, because she bared her teeth and tried to crawl away from him, but managed only a few inches before collapsing face down in the grass. Her breathing came in shallow pants, each one costing her, and Zachary knew he had minutes at most to make a decision. The right thing would be to inform the militia captain in town, let them know one of the enemy had survived, but when he looked at her broken body and remembered the stories of what they did to orc prisoners, his conscience made the choice for him. He stripped off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, then lifted her as carefully as he could, cradling her against his chest. She weighed less than he expected despite her muscular build, hollowed out by days without food or water beneath that pile of death. She did not fight him this time, too weak or too resigned to her fate, and her head lolled against his shoulder as he began the long walk back to his farmstead. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded him uncomfortably of fire and blood, and he picked up his pace. His farm sat a mile from the burial site, a modest collection of buildings at the edge of the frontier, far enough from town that neighbors minded their own business and questions came rarely. The main house was small but sturdy, built by his father 20 years back, and the barn stood behind it with the chicken coop and pig pen completing his little kingdom. He had inherited it all when fever took his parents 4 winters past, and had worked the land alone ever since, content with his solitude and his animals. He carried the orc girl into the house through the back door, unwilling to risk even the unlikely chance of someone seeing him from the road. His kitchen was warm from the banked fire in the hearth, and he laid her on the long wooden table he used for meals and butchering, sweeping aside the vegetables he had been preparing for supper. She groaned when he moved her, a sound so human in its pain that his chest tightened, and he lit 2 more lamps to see by. The wound in her side was infected. He saw that immediately when he cut away the ruined armor and the shirt beneath. Something had pierced her deep, a sword or spear, and the flesh around it was angry red and weeping. He had treated his share of injuries over the years, animals mostly, but his own hurts too, and he knew enough to understand she would die without help. The question was whether he had the skill to provide it. Zachary set water to boil and gathered his supplies, the needle and thread he used for torn flesh, the bottle of strong spirits his father had sworn by for cleaning wounds, and clean cloth torn from an old sheet. When he returned to the table, she was watching him through half-closed eyes, tracking his movements with predator awareness even in her weakened state. He showed her his hands, empty and open, then pointed to her wound. "I need to clean this," he said, knowing she likely could not understand him but needing to speak anyway. "It's going to hurt, but if I don't do it, you'll die. Do you understand?" She said nothing, just continued to watch him with those amber eyes that seemed to glow in the lamplight. He took her silence as consent, or perhaps acknowledgement of her lack of options, and began his work. He poured the spirits over the wound first, and she arched off the table with a strangled scream, her teeth bared and her hand shooting out to grab his wrist with crushing strength. He froze, meeting her eyes, and saw rage there mixed with agony. But after a long moment she released him and forced herself flat again, trembling with the effort of control. He worked as quickly as he could, cleaning away the infection and the debris buried in her flesh, then stitched the wound closed with small, careful movements. She made no sound after that first scream, but her breathing came harsh through her nose and sweat beaded on her green skin. When he finished, she had passed out, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion and pain, and he covered her with a blanket and let her rest. That first night he slept in the chair beside the table, his father's old hunting rifle across his lap, unsure if she would wake violent or afraid. She did neither, sleeping through the darkness with only occasional whimpers to mark her dreams, and when dawn light crept through the windows, he found her watching him again, fully awake this time. "Hungry?" he asked, and though she tensed at his voice, something in her eyes suggested she understood the basic question. He made porridge, thick with honey and butter, and helped her sit up enough to eat. She accepted the spoon from him warily, as if expecting poison or a trick, but hunger won out over caution and she ate with desperate efficiency, burning her mouth in her haste. He learned her name the second day, when she had recovered enough strength to speak. "Grutha," she said, tapping her chest, and he repeated it back until he got the pronunciation right, the guttural sound of it rough in his mouth. She learned his name the same way, and though his name came out slightly different in her accent, hearing it from her lips sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. The days fell into a rhythm after that, a strange domestic pattern born of necessity. He moved her from the table to his own bed after the third day, taking his blankets to the floor beside her, and she watched him with increasing curiosity as he tended to her wound and brought her food. She healed faster than a human would, he noticed, her orc constitution burning through the infection and knitting flesh back together with impressive speed. By the end of the first week, she could sit up on her own, and by the second, she could stand and walk to the privy with only a little support. Communication remained difficult, a mixture of gestures and repeated words, but they developed a working vocabulary. Food, water, pain, better, sleep, outside simple concepts that covered their basic needs. She began to help where she could, insisting despite his protests, and he found her folding blankets one afternoon with meticulous care, her strong hands gentle with the fabric. When she caught him watching, she looked away quickly, something almost like shame crossing her features. "You don't have to," he said, but she shook her head and continued, and he understood that she needed this, needed to feel useful rather than helpless. The complications started in the third week when Samuel Winters rode out from town with supplies and news. Zachary saw him coming from far off and had just enough time to get Grutha into the root cellar, pressing a finger to his lips in the universal gesture for silence. She understood immediately, fear flashing in her eyes as she descended the ladder, and he shut the door and rolled a barrel over it before stepping outside to meet his visitor. Samuel was a good man, a fellow farmer who had lost his wife to illness 2 years back, and they had developed a casual friendship born of shared hardship and the occasional evening of cards and whiskey. He dismounted with a grin and a hearty handshake, then launched into the gossip from town without preamble. "You hear about the orc they're hunting?" Samuel asked as he helped unload the supplies from his horse, bags of flour and salt and other staples Zachary had ordered. Someone reported seeing tracks near the old marrow field, fresh ones, heading this direction. Captain's got folks worked up thinking one of those savages survived the slaughter and is lurking about. Zachary kept his expression neutral, continuing to work. "Just one. Seems like a lot of fuss." "Well, you know how folks get. Already had 2 families pack up and head back east, scared for their children and whatnot. Captain's organizing patrols, wants everyone to keep their eyes open and their guns loaded." Samuel paused, studying him. "You haven't seen anything unusual out here, have you? No missing livestock, no strange signs?" "Nothing," Zachary lied, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. "But I'll keep watch." They spent another hour talking, and by the time Samuel rode off, Zachary's nerves were wound tight as wire. He waited until the dust from the road settled before opening the cellar, and found Grutha sitting on the bottom step, her body tense and her hand wrapped around a broken hoe handle like a weapon. They stared at each other in the dim light, and he saw in her eyes that she had understood enough, had heard the fear and anger in Samuel's voice even if she could not parse the words. "They're looking for you," he said quietly, and she nodded, already knowing, already accepting. That night she tried to leave. He woke to the sound of the door and found her in the yard, dressed in his spare clothes that hung too large on her frame, his hunting knife tucked into her belt. The moon hung full and bright overhead, painting everything in silver, and when he called her name she turned to face him with her jaw set and determined. "No," he said, crossing the distance between them. "You're not well enough yet. You'll die out there." She spoke in her own language then, a rapid string of harsh syllables that he could not understand, but her meaning was clear in her gestures toward the house, and then away. In the protective way she angled her body between him and the wilderness. She was trying to keep him safe, he realized, trying to draw the danger away from his home. "I don't care," he said, and grabbed her arm, gentler than he could have been but firm enough to make his point. "I didn't pull you out of that grave just to watch you throw your life away. You're staying until you're healed, until you're strong enough to survive out there. Do you understand?" They stood facing each other in the moonlight, locked in a battle of wills, and finally she sagged, defeat written in every line of her body. He led her back inside, and she went to bed without argument, but he caught her crying silently in the darkness. Her face turned to the wall, and something cracked open in his chest at the sound. He began teaching her his language in earnest after that, spending the evenings by the fire with her, pointing at objects and repeating words until she could say them back. She learned quickly, hungry for communication, and within days they could exchange simple sentences. Her voice was deeper than a human woman's, rougher, but there was a musicality to it that he found himself listening for. "Why you help me?" she asked one night, the question that had clearly been burning in her mind since the beginning. They sat across from each other at the table, the remains of dinner between them, and her amber eyes pinned him in place. He considered lying, or giving some noble reason, but settled on the truth. Because you were dying and I couldn't walk away. Because it was the right thing to do. Humans kill orcs, she said, her accent thick but her meaning clear. We kill humans. We are enemies. Maybe, he acknowledged, but you weren't trying to kill anyone when I found you. You were just trying to breathe. She absorbed this in silence, her fingers tracing patterns on the worn wood of the table, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. My clan will think I am dead. They will not look for me. I'm sorry. She shook her head. It is the way. The weak die, the strong survive. But her eyes told a different story, grief and loss swimming in their depths, and he understood that she had lost more than her clan in that pit of bodies. You had family in the battle, he said, not a question, and she nodded. Brother, 2 sisters, father. She touched her chest over her heart. All gone. He reached across the table without thinking and covered her hand with his own, a gesture of comfort he would have offered any mourning soul. She startled at the contact, staring at their joined hands as if seeing something impossible, but she did not pull away. They sat like that for a long time, connected by shared grief, his for parents lost to fever, hers for family lost to war, and when she finally withdrew her hand, the distance between them felt different somehow, less vast. The patrols came closer as October deepened into November, riders passing on the road with increasing frequency. Zachary kept Grutha hidden during the day, and she moved through his house like a ghost, silent and careful. But at night, they sat together and talked, her grasp of his language improving daily, and he found himself telling her things he had never spoken aloud, his loneliness, his doubts, the way the farm felt too big and too empty with only him to fill it. She shared her own stories in return, tales of her clan's nomadic life, the harsh beauty of the orc territories beyond the mountains, the songs they sang and the traditions they kept. She told him about her mother, dead in childbirth with her youngest sister, and how her father had raised them to be warriors, to fight and survive in a world that wanted them dead. Her voice cracked when she spoke of finding her father's body in the battle, already cold, his axe still gripped in his hand. He teach me to fight, she said, staring into the fire. Say I am strong, say I will lead clan someday. A bitter laugh escaped her. Now there is no clan to lead. You'll find a new path, Zachary said, believing it even if she did not. You're strong enough to survive anything. She turned to look at him then, something shifting in her expression, and for a moment he thought she might speak, but instead she just nodded and looked away, her jaw working as if chewing on words she could not say. He noticed his awareness of her changing as the weeks passed, small details that he had no business noticing. The way she moved with unconscious grace despite her muscular build, economic and efficient. The rare times she smiled, her tusks catching the light, and how it transformed her entire face from severe to beautiful. The low, rumbling sound she made sometimes when she was content, almost like purring, that she seemed unaware of. The smell of her, earth and smoke, and something wild that made his pulse quicken. He tried to ignore it, this growing attraction that defied all logic and propriety, but it was like trying to ignore a storm on the horizon. It came on regardless of his will, building with every shared meal and quiet conversation, until he found himself lying awake at night acutely aware of her breathing on the other side of the room, knowing she was mere feet away and utterly forbidden. The first snow came in late November, a light dusting that melted by midday, and Grutha stood at the window watching it fall with wonder on her face. She had never seen snow before, she told him, her clan's territory too far south, and he found himself offering to take her outside to feel it properly. They stood in the yard as the flakes drifted down, and she tilted her face up to the sky with her eyes closed, catching snowflakes on her tongue like a child. When she opened her eyes and caught him watching, something passed between them, a moment of recognition and possibility that hung in the cold air. He stepped closer, drawn by instinct older than thought, and she did not retreat. Her eyes searched his face, questions and fear and want all tangled together, and he raised his hand slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her cheek. Her skin was warm despite the cold, her jaw strong beneath his palm, and she leaned into his touch with a shaky exhale that made his heart stutter. They stood like that, frozen in more than temperature, until the sound of horses on the road shattered the moment and sent them scrambling back inside, the spell broken but not forgotten. The incident left them both on edge, dancing around each other in the small space of the house, and the tension grew until it felt like a physical thing between them. She began finding excuses to touch him, small things like brushing past him in the kitchen or steadying herself with a hand on his shoulder, and each contact sent electricity racing through his nerves. He caught her watching him when she thought he was focused on other things, her gaze hungry and confused. It came to a head one evening in early December when he returned from the barn to find her attempting to bathe from the large basin, struggling to reach the healing wound on her back. She had stripped to the waist, her green skin gleaming in the firelight, and when she turned at his entrance her eyes went wide with something between embarrassment and defiance. "Let me help," he said, his voice rougher than intended, and after a moment she nodded and turned her back to him, presenting the injury. He wet a cloth and cleaned the area gently, his hand steady despite the hammering of his heart, and tried very hard not to notice the elegant line of her spine or the way she shivered under his touch. "Zachary," she said softly, and something in the way she spoke his name made him pause. She turned to face him, making no move to cover herself, and met his eyes with fierce honesty. "I want to stay, not because I must, because I want." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning, and he understood what she was offering, what she was asking. "The patrols won't stop," he said, giving her the truth she deserved. "Eventually someone will find out. They'll kill you and probably me too for harboring you. I know." She reached up and cupped his face with both hands, mimicking his gesture from the snow, and her touch burned. "Still, I want to stay. With you." He should have been stronger, should have thought of all the reasons this was impossible, but when she leaned in and pressed her lips to his, tentative and questioning, all his defenses crumbled. He kissed her back with months of loneliness and need, pulling her against him, and she made that low, rumbling sound deep in her chest that drove him wild. Her tusks were strange against his mouth but not unpleasant, just different, and when he ran his hands down her back, she gasped and arched into him. They came together with desperate urgency, months of tension and denial exploding into passion, and he carried her to his bed where they learned each other's bodies with reverent attention. She was strong enough to match him, to give as good as she got, and when they finally collapsed together in a tangle of limbs, breathless and satisfied, he felt more complete than he had in years. Afterward she lay with her head on his chest, tracing idle patterns on his skin, and he stroked her hair, still hardly believing this was real. "I love you," he said into the darkness, because it was true and needed saying. "I don't care what anyone thinks, I love you." She lifted her head to look at him, tears gleaming in her eyes, and spoke in her own language first, a string of words he did not know but understood in his bones. Then in his tongue, carefully, "I love you too. My heart is yours." They lived in stolen time after that, knowing it could not last but unable to give up the joy they had found. Winter deepened, and the patrols decreased with the snow, giving them a reprieve, and they made the most of it. He taught her to cook human food, and she taught him orc songs, his clumsy pronunciation making her laugh until tears ran down her face. They celebrated the winter solstice together, making up their own traditions, and she carved him a small figure of an orc and human standing together, their hands joined, that he treasured above all his possessions. But the world outside did not forget, and in late January a rider came at full gallop to his door, pounding hard enough to rattle the frame. Zachary opened it to find Samuel Winters, wild-eyed and urgent, already talking before the door was fully open. "You need to leave now tonight. Captain's coming tomorrow with a full squad. They've got word there's an orc hiding somewhere in this area, and they're searching every farm. If you're keeping anything from me, Zach, if you know anything, you need to tell me now." Zachary's mind raced, calculating distances and time. "Why are you telling me this?" Samuel met his eyes, and in them Zachary saw knowledge and acceptance. "Because I saw her 3 weeks back when I was riding home late, saw her in your window, and because you're my friend and I figure you've got your reasons." He glanced over his shoulder at the road. "But they'll kill her on sight and you for treason, so you need to go." "Thank you," Zachary said, the words inadequate but sincere. "Thank you, Samuel." His friend nodded once and rode off, disappearing into the growing dusk, and Zachary shut the door and turned to find Grutha standing there, already understanding. They packed in silence, taking only what they could carry: food, water, warm clothes, and his father's rifle. He felt the weight of leaving his home, the only place he had ever known. But when he looked at Grutha, the choice was simple. They left as the moon rose, heading north away from town and the patrols, into the deep wilderness that bordered the orc territories. The snow was thick and the going hard, but they pushed through the night and into the next day, putting distance between them and pursuit. When they finally stopped to rest in a cave sheltered from the wind, exhaustion dragged at them both like weights. "I am sorry," Grutha said, her voice thick with guilt. "You lose everything for me." He pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "I chose you. That's not losing, that's winning." They traveled for 2 weeks, following game trails and avoiding settlements, living off what they could hunt and forage. The orc territories grew closer each day, and Grutha became increasingly tense, though she would not say why. He learned the reason when they crested a ridge and found themselves facing a hunting party of orcs, 6 warriors bristling with weapons and hostility. The lead warrior, a massive male with scars covering his arms, spoke in rapid orcish, his tone aggressive, and Grutha stepped forward to answer, placing herself between Zachary and the weapons. The conversation was heated, voices rising and falling, and though he could not understand the words, he caught his name several times and saw the way the warriors stared at him with open disgust. Finally, Grutha turned to him, her expression carefully neutral. "They say humans are not welcome in orc lands. They say I should kill you to prove my loyalty to my people." His hand moved to his rifle, but she caught his wrist, shaking her head. "They also say I may challenge for the right to keep you. If I win, you are under my protection. If I lose, they kill us both." "Then win," he said simply, and saw surprise flicker across her face before being replaced by determination. The fight was brutal and quick, Grutha facing off against the lead warrior with only her fists and her will. She was still not fully recovered from her wounds, slower than she should have been, and the warrior was larger and stronger. But she fought with everything she had, taking hits that would have felled a human and coming back for more. And when she finally got her arm around his throat and squeezed until he tapped submission, the other warriors roared their approval. She helped her opponent stand, exchanging words in their language, and then turned to Zachary with blood streaming from her nose and a triumphant grin. "You are mine now, by orc law. They must accept you." The hunting party led them back to their clan, a collection of hide tents and rough structures in a valley protected from the worst of the wind. Eyes followed them as they walked through the camp, curious and suspicious, and Zachary felt the weight of being utterly alien in this place. But Grutha held her head high, her hand clasped in his, and dared anyone to challenge her claim. They gave her a tent at the edge of camp, small but private, and she set about making it habitable with fierce determination. The clan was not her original family, she explained as they worked, but a neighboring group that had been allies. They accepted her as one of their own because she had proven herself in combat, and would accept him because she claimed him as mate. Mate. He asked, the words settling strangely in his mind. She paused in her work, suddenly uncertain. "Is this wrong word, I mean? You are mine, I am yours, forever." "Like marriage," he said, understanding, and she nodded eagerly. "Yes, marriage. In orc tradition, we fight for right to choose mate, and then we are bound until death. I fight for you. You are my husband now if you accept." He crossed the small space and pulled her into his arms, answering her with a kiss that left no doubt of his acceptance. "Then I guess that makes you my wife." Integration into clan life was difficult at first, the barriers of language and culture seemingly insurmountable. But Grutha taught him their ways with patient determination, and slowly the clan began to accept his presence. He helped where he could, using his farming knowledge to improve their food stores and his carpentry skills to repair structures. The children were the first to warm to him, fascinated by this strange human who spoke their language badly and did not understand their games, and where the children led the adults followed. Zachary learned that orcs were nothing like the savage monsters humans painted them as. They had complex social structures, rich traditions, and a deep connection to the land. They valued strength and honor, but also loyalty and family. They laughed and loved and grieved just as humans did, their emotions written larger and bolder but no less genuine. Spring came to the valley, melting the snow and bringing new life, and with it a problem that threatened to shatter their fragile peace. A messenger arrived from the human settlements with an ultimatum. Return the traitor Zachary Sullivan to face justice for treason, or face retaliation. The clan council gathered to debate, and Grutha stood before them to plead their case. Zachary waited outside the council tent, his fate being decided in a language he now understood, but could not speak fluently enough to defend himself. When Grutha emerged hours later, she looked exhausted but relieved. "They will not give you to the humans," she said, taking his hands. "But they say you must prove your value to the clan, must show that you are worth the risk of war. You have until summer to prove yourself." He spent the next months working harder than he ever had in his life, applying every skill he possessed to benefit the clan. He taught them crop rotation and irrigation techniques that increased their yield. He helped construct a smokehouse for preserving meat. He organized the hunters to track game more efficiently, using tactics from his years of hunting for his own table. And slowly, grudgingly, the clan began to see him not as a liability but as an asset. The true test came in early summer when a band of human raiders attacked a neighboring orc settlement, killing indiscriminately and burning homes. The clan prepared for war, and Grutha asked him the impossible question: "Will you fight beside us, against your own people?" He thought of the men who would kill Grutha for the crime of being born, who had buried her in a mass grave and left her to die. He thought of Samuel Winters, the only human who had shown him kindness when it mattered, and wondered if he was among the raiders. But mostly he thought of the clan that had taken him in, of the children who called him uncle in their language, of the warriors who had slowly become his friends. "They stopped being my people when they chose hate over humanity," he said. "My people are here now." The battle was fierce and short, the orc warriors overwhelming the smaller raiding party with brutal efficiency. Zachary fought alongside them, his rifle taking down 2 raiders before they could reach the clan's warriors, and when it was over he stood covered in blood and smoke, feeling hollowed out and ancient. Grutha found him afterward and held him while he shook, understanding the cost of what he had done. But the clan saw and understood, and when they returned to the valley, the council called him before them and declared him a full member of the clan, no longer a human tolerated for his mate's sake, but one of their own. They gave him an orc name in addition to his human one, a string of syllables that meant bridge walker for standing between 2 worlds, and he wore it with pride. Summer deepened into autumn, and the seasons turned once more, bringing them to a year since he had pulled Grutha from that grave. They stood together on the ridge overlooking the valley, watching the clan prepare for the coming winter, and she rested her hand on her belly where new life grew, the child that would be the first of their family. "You regret it?" she asked softly. "Giving up your old life for this?" He considered the question seriously, thinking of his farm and his old solitude, the simple life he had known before she crawled out of death and into his world. Then he thought of everything that had come after the love, the struggle, the joy of finding where he truly belonged. "Not for a single moment," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "You are my home now. This is where I belong." She leaned against him, solid and warm, and together they watched the sun set over the valley, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. Below them, the clan moved about their evening tasks, smoke rising from cooking fires, children playing while adults prepared for the night. Their people, their home. The human settlements still whispered stories of the traitor who ran off with an orc savage, tales growing more distorted with each telling. Let them talk, Zachary thought. Let them spin their cautionary tales and cling to their prejudice. He had found something more valuable than acceptance from people who would never understand. He had found love that transcended the boundaries others tried to impose. A partnership built on choice and sacrifice, and stubborn refusal to let the world dictate who deserved happiness. Winter came again to the valley, harsh and beautiful, and their daughter was born during the first snowfall, arriving with lusty cries that announced her determination to be heard. She had her mother's green skin and small tusks, but her father's blue eyes, a perfect bridge between 2 worlds. They named her Mara, a name that worked in both languages, and she became the clan's favorite, passed from arms to arms with joy and wonder. Zachary watched his daughter grow through that winter and into spring, marveling at her fierce spirit and quick mind. She would grow up in a world that might not accept her, caught between human and orc, but she would be strong enough to forge her own path. They would make sure of it. More children followed in the years after, 2 sons who inherited their father's height and their mother's strength, and the small tent at the edge of camp grew into a proper dwelling that rang with laughter and life. The clan flourished too, Zachary's innovations and Grutha's leadership combining to bring prosperity. Other outcast orcs found their way to the valley, and gradually even a few humans, those who had been cast out or who simply sought a different way of living, creating a community that existed outside the rigid boundaries of prejudice. The human settlements continued to raid occasionally, and the clan defended their territory with determination. But as the years passed, the attacks grew less frequent. Perhaps word had spread that this particular group of orcs was not worth the cost, or perhaps the humans had larger concerns. Either way, A kind of uneasy peace settled over the borderlands, and Zachary allowed himself to hope that his children might grow up in a world with less hatred than the one he had known. 5 years after he had carried Grutha from that mass grave, a rider approached the valley under a white flag of truce. Zachary went to meet them with Grutha at his side, and recognized the weathered face of Samuel Winters, older now and bearing the marks of hard years, but alive. "Hello, Zach," Samuel said, dismounting carefully. "I've been looking for you for a long time." They invited him into their home, offering food and drink while the clan watched with wary curiosity. Samuel looked around at the dwelling, at the children playing in the corner, at the life Zachary had built, and shook his head in wonder. "I had to see it with my own eyes," he said. "The rumors said you had gone native, joined up with the orcs, but I needed to know you were alive and well." "I'm more than well," Zachary said, taking Grutha's hand. "I'm happy, happier than I ever was before." Samuel studied them both, then nodded slowly. "I can see that. I'm glad." He hesitated, then continued. "I came to tell you that the captain's dead, died last winter." The new ones got different priorities, more concerned with defending what we have than expanding territory. "The warrant on you has been quietly forgotten, and if you wanted to come back, visit the settlements, you probably could." Zachary looked at Grutha, saw the question in her eyes, and shook his head. "This is my home now. These are my people. But thank you for telling me and for riding all this way." Samuel stayed for 3 days, and in that time Zachary watched his old friend's perceptions shift as he interacted with the clan, seeing them as individuals rather than monsters. When he rode out again, he carried letters for the settlement leaders, proposals for trade and treaties, the beginnings of something that might eventually grow into real peace. It would take generations, Zachary knew, to undo centuries of hatred and fear. But it had to start somewhere, with someone willing to cross the divide and refuse to come back. He had been that bridge, however unintentionally, and their children would carry it forward, proving by their very existence that the walls between people were artificial and could be torn down. More years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their family. Zachary's hair began to gray at the temples while Grutha remained strong and vital, orcs aging more slowly than humans. They spoke of it sometimes, the fact that she would likely outlive him by decades, and she would grow fierce and protective, demanding that he take better care of himself, as if will alone could hold back time. "When I am gone," he said one evening as they sat together watching the sunset, a ritual they had maintained through all the years, "I need you to promise me something." "Do not speak of such things," she growled, but he continued anyway. "Promise me you'll find joy again after grief runs its course, that you won't lock yourself away from life. The clan will need your strength, and our children will need your wisdom." She was quiet for a long time, her jaw working, and when she spoke her voice was thick with unshed tears. "I will promise this, if you promise to live as many years as possible, and not leave me before you must." "That I can do," he agreed, and they sealed it with a kiss that still carried the spark of their first, despite the years between. The threat came in their 10th year together, not from humans but from within the orc territories. A warlord named Kragoth sought to unite the scattered clans under his rule, preaching a return to the old ways and the elimination of all human influence. His forces swept through the borderlands, absorbing some clans and destroying those who refused, and it became clear that their valley would eventually face his attention. The clan council debated for days, weighing options that all seemed equally terrible. Flee deeper into the wilderness and abandon the home they had built. Submit to Kragoth and hope he allowed them to maintain some autonomy, or stand and fight against forces that vastly outnumbered them. Grutha stood before the council with the authority of her years and her proven leadership and proposed a fourth option. "We ask for help from the humans." The council erupted into shouting, the very idea an insult to everything they believed, but she stood her ground. "Pride will not save our children. Tradition will not keep our homes from burning. If we are to survive, we must be willing to set aside old hatreds and find new allies." The debate raged for hours, but in the end desperation won out over pride. They sent messengers to the human settlements with an offer. "Help us defeat Kragoth, and we will establish lasting peace treaties, share resources and knowledge, create trade routes that benefit both our peoples." It was a gamble that could end with betrayal and massacre, but they were out of options. Zachary rode with the messengers, his presence lending credibility to the proposal. The humans debated as fiercely as the orcs had, but eventually the promise of peace and the threat of a warmongering warlord on their borders convinced enough of them. They agreed to send forces to assist the Valley clan, and riders were dispatched to gather warriors. Kragoth's army arrived at the valley 3 weeks later, a massive force of hardened fighters carrying banners of war. They found the valley defended not just by orcs, but by humans standing shoulder to shoulder with their former enemies, united by the simple desire to protect their homes and families. The warlord himself rode to the front lines, massive and battle-scarred, and demanded the clan's surrender. Grutha stepped forward to answer, Zachary at her side. "We do not surrender. We do not bow to tyrants. If you want this valley, you will have to take it over our bodies, and we will make the cost so high that you will regret ever marching on this place." Kragoth laughed, a sound like grinding stones. "You stand with humans now. You have become weak, forgotten what it means to be orc. I will crush you and scatter your bones as a lesson to others who would betray their own kind." "You know nothing of strength," Grutha shot back. "Strength is not just in the arm that wields the axe, but in the courage to change, to adapt, to build rather than destroy. You are the past and we are the future. Come then, if you must, and learn which is stronger." The battle that followed would be spoken of for generations. The day when orcs and humans fought together against a common enemy and proved that old enmities could be set aside. It raged from dawn until dusk, the valley floor running red with blood from both sides, and Zachary fought with desperate determination, protecting his family and his home with every skill he possessed. He found himself at one point facing 3 of Kragoth's warriors, his rifle empty and only his knife remaining, and thought this might be where his story ended. But Grutha appeared beside him like an avenging angel, her axe singing through the air, and together they cut through the enemy warriors with the perfect synchronization of partners who knew each other's movements as well as their own. When Kragoth himself fell, struck down by the combined efforts of the clan's best warriors, his army broke and fled, and the defenders raised a cheer that echoed off the valley walls. They had won, at a terrible cost in lives and blood, but they had won. And more importantly, they had won together. The aftermath brought change that rippled outward from the valley like waves from a stone dropped in water. The humans who had fought beside orcs returned to their settlements with new perspectives, and the trade treaties were formalized and expanded. Not everyone accepted the new reality. There would always be those on both sides who clung to hatred and fear, but enough did that real peace became possible. Zachary watched his children grow to adulthood in this changing world, saw them move between human and orc communities with an ease he could only marvel at. His daughter Mara became a trader, carrying goods and knowledge between the settlements, her mixed heritage an asset rather than a hindrance. His sons became leaders in their own right, one a warrior respected by both peoples, the other a craftsman whose work was sought after far and wide. Gray turned to white in his hair and beard, and his joints began to protest the cold winters, but he remained active and engaged with clan life. He taught the young ones farming and carpentry, passing on the skills that had proven so valuable, and spent his evenings with Grutha, talking or sitting in comfortable silence that spoke of decades together. 20 years after pulling her from that grave, they stood on their ridge again, older and marked by time but still together. The valley below had grown, permanent structures replacing many of the temporary dwellings, and in the distance they could see human wagons approaching for trade, a sight that had become commonplace. You ever think about what your life would have been if you had walked past that grave? Grutha asked, her arm around his waist. If you had let me die, sometimes, he admitted. I imagine I would have lived quietly on my farm, alone and lonely, growing old without ever knowing what I was missing. And then I thank whatever gods might exist that I looked at the right moment, that I saw your hand move, that I was fool enough to pull you out. She turned to face him, cupping his weathered face in her strong hands. Not fool, brave, kind, everything I needed even when I did not know I needed it. You saved me in that grave, but you kept saving me every day after, with your love and your patience and your refusal to accept the world as it was instead of as it could be. We saved each other, he said, and kissed her while the sun set behind them, painting the sky in the same shades of orange and red it had the day he carried her home. But now those colors spoke of warmth and life rather than death and blood. The seasons continued their eternal cycle, and Zachary Sullivan lived to see his grandchildren born, small and perfect mixtures of human and orc, representing a future he had helped build. His body grew frailer as the years accumulated, but his mind remained sharp and his heart full, surrounded by family and clan who loved him as one of their own. When the end came finally, on a clear spring morning in his 32nd year with Grutha, he was ready. He lay in their bed with his wife holding his hand, their children and grandchildren gathered around, and he looked at each of them with profound gratitude for the life they had given him. I love you, he told Grutha, the same words he had spoken countless times, but never losing their meaning. Thank you for crawling out of that grave. Thank you for choosing me. Always, she said, tears streaming down her face. In this life and whatever comes after, I choose you always. He closed his eyes with her hand in his and her voice in his ears, and slipped away peacefully, knowing he had lived a life of meaning and purpose, that he had made a difference, that he had loved and been loved in return. The clan mourned him with full honors, human and orc alike gathering to pay respects to the bridge walker who had shown them a better way. They buried him on the ridge overlooking the valley, the place he had loved best, and Grutha planted a tree over his grave, a strong oak that would stand for generations as a living memorial. She grieved deeply, as she had promised, but did not let it consume her. She lived on for many more decades, leading the clan with wisdom and strength, watching the peace they had built grow and spread until the borderlands became a place where human and orc children played together without fear, where mixed families were common enough to cause no comment, where the old hatreds faded into history. And sometimes, in the quiet moments of evening, she would climb to the ridge and sit beside the oak tree and speak to the man who slept beneath it, telling him of their grandchildren's accomplishments and the world that continued to change and grow more beautiful. She told him of her day and her thoughts, maintaining the conversation they had shared for so many years, and sometimes she swore she could feel his presence in the rustle of leaves or the warmth of the setting sun. When her own time came at last, well over 100 years old by human reckoning, she asked to be buried beside him, and the clan honored her wish. 2 graves beneath the oak tree on the ridge. A human and an orc who had loved each other enough to change the world, their legacy living on in the peace and unity they had helped create. The valley flourished in the generations after, becoming a symbol of what was possible when people chose compassion over fear, love over hate, change over tradition. Humans and orcs lived and worked together, created families together, built a society that honored the best of both cultures and left behind the worst. It was not perfect, no society ever is, but it was better, and that was enough. And every spring, when the oak tree on the ridge burst into new leaf, the clan would gather there to celebrate the festival of the Bridge Walkers, honoring Zachary and Grutha and the countless others who had been brave enough to cross the divides that separated people and prove that love was stronger than any barrier. They would share food and stories, human and orc children playing together in the shadow of the tree, and remember that the world they enjoyed had been bought with courage and sacrifice, and the simple decision of one man to not walk past a grave where a hand still moved. The story spread far beyond the valley, carried by traders and travelers, growing into legend but never losing its essential truth. It became a tale parents told their children on both sides of the old borders, a reminder that the person you save might save you in return, that love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, that the future belonged to those brave enough to build bridges instead of walls. And beneath the oak tree on the ridge, Zachary and Grutha rested together, their story complete, their love eternal, their impact on the world immeasurable. They had lived ordinary lives in extraordinary ways, had chosen each other against all odds and all expectations, and had proven that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to see another person's humanity and refuse to look away. The sun set over the valley as it had thousands of times before, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, and the oak tree stood silent vigil over the graves of 2 souls who had found each other in death and chosen life, who had built a love strong enough to change the world, who had proved that the only thing more powerful than hate was the courage to love anyway.